miss.
Yes, recording is not a problem. Streaming it live is a little more annoying. It just means logging out of things and logging into things, which is only mildly annoying. But speaking of which, let's stop talking about technology and start talking about important things like Omicron. No, let's not talk about Omicron. Let's talk about Talmud. We have a good class today. I've been warning you for weeks that it was coming, and it's finally here. We're actually going to get to talking about this really interesting mishnah, which will tangentially touch on an important issue around transgendered individuals in Jewish law. And we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about that. I over-prepared the last 2 weeks, and then we never got there. So I probably have under-prepared this week so that I could take a shower. I hope that's okay with everybody. Yeah, I know, right? You can't smell me through Zoom, but if I don't take a shower, we might actually get to that point. This is where we are in the text. We're at Rosh Hashanah on the Sefaria link. We're at 29a.6, meaning we're at the 6th note. But of course, I will screen share for all of you. So
is this class, Mark, is this class always recorded?
No, it is not always.
It hasn't been. Rabbi Jeremy did.
Right, Jeremy always recorded it. I was just, Rabbi Judy, I was just explaining that it's like a half an hour out of my time to throw it up on the website. So unless I feel fairly likely that the class is recorded, but Talmud is generally going to be recorded and always has been. I recognize that you may not want it to be recorded, Judy, but people need to be able to catch up. The other class, the discussion is not recorded, so that you'll never have to worry about. Okay. Judy's going to go put her hair in curlers. So I'm just kidding. Most Jews, as Jews, we were not aware of the existence of curlers when I was a kid, because why would
I do not need curlers?
I know.
I do not need curlers, but I speak
Neither do I.
That's the joke. Olivia threw me a correction in the chat. Olivia, thank you. The correct terminology is transgendered. It is it has a verb.
No, you have to understand. It's not transgendered. You keep on saying ed at the end. There's no ed.
I thought I was saying transgender, but maybe
I kept on hearing it with an ed at the end. There's no ed at the end. It's not a verb.
I wrote it down with an ed, so that's what you said.
I was at least in my head, I was saying transgender. But if I said transgendered, I apologize. So it is a noun, not a verb. Okay, let's keep going. Right, it's like, by the way, for those of you who have heard this before, that is a lot like how people say Reformed Judaism instead of Reform Judaism. It is not reformed. You were not formerly Jewish and then you reformed yourself. You are. Reform is a verb, is the name of a article that some rabbi wrote one time. Let's do some actual Talmud. Stop talking about things. We are on to the Gemara. We're going to start with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is going to take us back thematically to the last idea that we were talking about, and then kind of move us forward. And it was talking about, it is related to the idea of intent, and we'll go back over that. All right, I'll do the Hebrew. Elisheva, you're going to do the English. Mat nitin. V'hayaka asher yarim Moshe yado v'gavar Yisrael v'gomre. V'chi yadav shel Moshe osot milchama o shovrot milchama. Ela lomar lach kol zman shehayu Yisrael mistaklin Kalape mala umeshabdin et libam la'avihem shabashamayim hayu mit gavrim v'im lav hayu noflim.
Mishnah. Incidental to the discussion of the required intent when sounding the shofar, the Mishnah cites the verse, "And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed." It may be asked, did the hands of Moses make war when he raised them, or break war when he lowered them? Rather, the verse comes to tell you that so long as the Jewish people turned their eyes upward, can you raise the page?
Yeah.
Rather, the verse comes to tell you that so long as the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. But if not, they fell.
Okay, so just a reminder of what this is. So the Mishnah is asking the question of intent, right, regarding shofar as the broader idea. But again, as mentioned last week, the Talmud will often kind of tangentially bring up an idea that the Torah raises, and it's also an opportunity for the rabbis to jump on and expound on a verse that has not already been recorded elsewhere in Torah. So as I mentioned last week, the back end of sugyas in Talmud are often the dumping ground for the editor. At least this is a theory that some have out there, and I subscribe to this theory. A dumping ground for the editor of the Talmud who sees lots of nice, juicy texts that don't really have a nice, neat, natural place to live, but you don't want to throw them out, so you throw them here. The Talmud and what's called the Tosefta are full of quotes that the rabbis wrote down that either didn't make it into the Torah, the Talmud, or kind of got tacked on at the end. So this might be what this is. The rabbis are expounding on this verse about this section in the Gemara where Moses had his hands up and Amalek was attacking. When Moses had his hands up, the Israelites won the battle, and when Moses' arms got tired, they lost the battle. And so what happened? Moses has Aaron and Hur prop up his two arms, and he continues to win the battle. The question that Gemara is asking is, was that, because there's a little bit of strangeness here, pun intended, avodah zorah, meaning like idol worship, right? Does Moses have magic powers? Because it's Moses who's raising his arms. And the answer is no, Moses does not have magic powers according to the rabbis of the Talmud. Moses is encouraging the people to believe in themselves when he puts his arms up, and they believe in God when he puts his arms up, and therefore they win. When Moses puts his arms down, they stop believing in themselves and they start losing the battle, right? Because otherwise, to suppose that Moses has magical powers is potentially blasphemous, okay? The other thing that's interesting about that is, and this was the thing that I mentioned last week, this is Dumbo's magic feather, right? This is not the Jewish people. This is not Moses raising his hands and doing magic. The feather is not actually magic to make Dumbo fly. It is instead that it causes Dumbo to believe he can fly. That's Moses's arms here. Mark Elliott Shapiro, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting because actually the people of Israel, what's happening is that that interpretation is giving the people of Israel an intent that they didn't have. You know, they happen to look up, you know, like, pardon the comparison, but like in a baseball game, you see someone hitting a home run, so you look up at the sky. So the interpreter is giving an additional meaning that they looked up, and therefore they subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, when perhaps most of them didn't even do that.
That's right. That's right. Right. Well said. All right, let's keep going. We're going to do the next section. This is still review, right? Well done. Mark, I'm going to have you read in the English if it's okay by you. Kayotse bedavar ata omer. Like, similarly, you can say, I love that. Kayotse bedavar. I don't think that works in modern Hebrew, but in rabbinic Hebrew, it sort of rabbinic Hebrew, it sort of makes sense, right? Kayotse bedavar would literally translate as, and it goes out from the matter. So similarly, you can see how similarly and as it goes out from the matter would be related. Oselacha saraf v'sim oto al nes v'haya kol hanashuch v'ra'a oto v'chai v'chi nachash memit o nachash mechaye ela b'zman sheYisrael mistaklin klape mala umishabdin et libam la'avihem shebashamayim hayu mit rapin v'im lav hayu nimukim.
Similarly, you could say, the verse states, make for yourself a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. Numbers 21:8. Once again, it may be asked, did the serpent kill or did the serpent preserve life? Rather, when the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed. But if not, they rotted from their snake bites.
Great, well done. So this is this very strange section in Torah that most rabbis skip right over in the Devar Torah every week because there's lots of better stuff in that week's Parsha about the people getting bit by snakes. And Moses fashions for them a golden serpent. Maybe it's Aaron, I don't remember, but I think it's Moses. And says, if you stare at the snake and you've been bitten, you'll be fine, right? And that's like hardcore heresy, right? Moses makes a golden idol and says it will heal all of you, right? And it is literally a graven image. Now, the way around this, of course, is to say it's not a graven image of God. It's a graven image of a medically, beneficial thing, which will heal you. By the way, I'm not entirely sure, but I have a suspicion that this is the root for the caduceus in medical practice, that it is healing.
Yes, it is.
It is the reason where this thing. Now, the other thing, the thing, you all knew that, but I didn't really. I remembered that from deep in my training. There's a more interesting thing to say, which is full-blown heresy. So if you don't like full-blown heresy, you can hit mute for like the next 30 seconds and come back. And I don't think I mentioned this last time. According to biblical critical theory, and not only biblical critical theory, but archaeologists have turned this up. The northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel, which existed between 973 before the Common Era and 586 of 722 before the Common Era, adopted different mascots, for lack of a better word, different physical symbols. And I believe, and I might be getting this wrong, the northern tribes adopted the bull and the southern tribes adopted the snake. And so according to Richard Elliott Friedman is the easiest of these to read, but if you wanted to go old school, you could read Julius Wellhausen. In biblical critical theory, every time you get a mention of a snake or a calf or a bull, that was one of the four authors of our Torah, J, E, P, or D, making a polemic against one of the other kingdoms, right? Or promoting their own mascot in this case. For more about this, read Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible. I can read that book and still have deep faith in the Lord our God. There are people who read those kinds of books and feel like they mess with their faith. So warning in advance. Okay, anyways. So the statement here that's still made, though, just to pull it out of the Gemara, finally, is to say, was it that they looked at the snake and the snake healed them? Chas v'shulam, right? God forbid. Actually, what happened is they looked at the snake and the snake was like a placebo. It was another Dumbo's magic feather that turned the Israelites' hearts to heaven, and that their hearts would then, have faith in God, and God would then heal them. By the way, I had a related conversation with a rabbi forever ago, which was a student at the Jewish summer camp that I went to when I was a counselor back 30 years ago, raised his hand and asked Rabbi Steve Leader, who's in Los Angeles, who was a assistant rabbi way back then, and said, during the Torah service, we take the Torah out and we parade it around and we lift it up and we bow to it and we say special blessings to it. How is that not avodah zarah? How is that not idol worship? And Rabbi Leader made a very convincing argument as to why it was not, because we actually, one of the things that's important out of that is we bow with the Torah. We don't bow at the Torah. We say, Gadlu l'Adonai iti, right? We glorify the Lord our God, right? So that verse specifically is a moment at which we turn away from the Torah and we remind ourselves, you might have thought this was avodah zarah, but actually we're praying to God. We're just using the Torah for this. A similar idea is that on top of the Ark of the Covenant were these two angels, right? Graven images, and yet they're on top of the holiest of the holy things in all of the Holy of Holies, in all of the temple, in all of Judaism. You could make an argument that that feels like a graven image. So for those who might argue that Judaism flirts with avodah zarah, the rabbis would argue back, no, there are physical images that we have in traditional Judaism that are like avodah zarah adjacent, right? They are graven images, but they are not actually graven images of God. They're just graven images in places at which God also appears. Now, Muslims get around this by never doing anything of the sort. I have to give it to Muslims. I think their intellectual purity in the matter is laudable. We have to do a whole lot of backflips in order to make sure we're not struggling with this. All right, Judy, and then Elisheva. And I think, Mark, you probably have a vestigial hand up, right?
No, that's.
Oh, you, right.
No, that.
It's an old one. Go ahead,
Please
Judy.
ignore the hand.
I think that psychologically, this is so apt that a symbol can remind you of a higher purpose.
Right.
And that was how I came to Judaism. I had an experience at the wall, and it changed my life. It changed my family's life. If somebody had told me that was going to happen, I would have said, you're crazy. I used to get Christmas cards. But I think that that can really happen. You see something that's symbolic, and all of a sudden you're open, your emotions, your intellect open, and you go to that higher plane.
Right.
And I think that happens to us often.
Right.
We may not realize it.
Yeah.
What the stimulus is. So I would say, I just thought of this, it's a stimulus to then go to a higher level.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great old phrase, and it's not from Judaism, I don't think, but that we are spiritual beings experiencing a physical reality, right? But that means that for a lot of us, in order to have that, to actuate the spiritual experience, we need to have physical symbols to hold on to, right? It helps. Like I've mentioned this like many, I think years ago, in a different context. One time we were driving through Israel on the way back from a teal when I was in rabbinical school, and we had to stop. We had to tell the bus driver, we got to stop because we haven't done Mincha Mariv. So we stopped to do Mincha Mariv. We did it at a highway stop behind a gas station, between the gas station and a dumpster, right? And I did the prayer service, right? And I also walk into the main sanctuary at Beth Shalom with its, high ceiling and its huge stained glass windows, and the hands of the Kohen Gadol, in iron over the Aron Kodesh. And it's this magnificent physical space, right? One thing is not like the other. Praying behind a dumpster by a highway and praying in a main sanctuary are not the same. And if we were truly spiritual beings, they would be the same, right? Our eyes would be, and our nose would be able to exclude the external world in order to have the spiritual experience. So I'm 110% with you, Judy. Elisheva and then Marian.
I was just going to make the quick comment with respect to Gadlut that I have very rarely seen Torah carriers, Torah holders, who know that they're supposed to bow the Torah at that point, not just themselves.
Right.
And it's always disappointing to me.
I think that's practical. As the guy who does everything from soup to nuts in Erie, I'm like trying to do 9 different things, and our Torahs are kind of standard size. They're not extra big or not extra small. I find that a healthy 45-year-old male with functioning knees and a good sense of balance, I can't bow very much. I am just barely tipping the thing forward because I am terrified of dropping the thing or falling straight over with it. So that's too extreme.
I mean, obviously you got to put an arm around it, but I have bowed the Torah maybe to 45 degrees.
Wow.
Not further than that, certainly, but at least that far.
Elisheva, you're a braver person than I. All right, Marian, go ahead.
Okay. What Judy said reminded me of the whole idea of the Jerusalem syndrome. And my husband kind of experienced that when we were on our tour to Israel the first time in 75. And he had thought that he was totally irreligious, really. But he thought he'd go to the wall and it would be something very interesting historically and archaeologically and so forth. And he had an experience. And that's what made him decide we should try living in Israel.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
That's great. That's great.
Well,
I
it's
have
very powerful.
I go both ways in which, when I lived in Jerusalem, and when I went to the Old City, I had a very, I had a profound experience back then. And then over time, because of becoming a conservative rabbi, the Western Wall has come to mean something very different to me. I won't elaborate on that, but basically, I now find I find spirituality in lots of different places, including in Jerusalem, but not necessarily at the Western Wall. But everybody gets down differently, and I don't begrudge anybody for their own personal physical spaces or symbols that are meaningful to them. All right, let's get to the guts of it, and let's get to the back end of the Mishnah, which I think is really the important part, or the most interesting thing for me, because they stopped droshing things. And by the way, the interesting thing, spoiler alert, the interesting thing about what we just did, the 2 verses of Torah, they do them in the Mishnah, and we do something very strange in Gemara, which is the rabbis just skip it. When we get to the Gemara, they just completely ignore the Torah verses. And I think that's because there's no halachic meaning to it, and or there's nothing that they find interesting to pull out of it. They just think like, these are good verses. They fit. Now, reminding you, these are both places where the individual had intent to do a thing, but the recipients didn't necessarily receive the intent the same way, or they did, right? So it's the similar thing to shofar and blowing shofar and hearing shofar is you have a leader actuating an experience and the listeners either plugging into the intent of that experience or not plugging into the intent of that experience. I think that's the shot of why the simple meaning of why those 2 verses were brought. Mark, go ahead. What did you want to say before we move on?
Maybe the rabbis thought that was a hot potato. And what we've just raised now about the question, is this idolatry or not? So they decided, okay, the rogue editor put it in, we'll leave it, but we'll just go ahead and do something else.
It's interesting. It's a good point. I don't remember from my schooling whether there's any implication within the Torah, within the Talmud, that there are rabbis in the Talmud who believe that the Torah may have been edited or monkeyed with. The only example I can think of that's off the top of my head is much later, which is there's a very famous line in Genesis by Ibn Ezra when they are reading through Genesis. And it says randomly in this place about Abraham, V'kanani az ba'aretz, and the Canaanites were yet in the land, which is really strange because the omniscient voice of the Torah placing us in a specific backward-looking time that the writer is writing in, right? The writer is saying, and the Canaanites were in the land back in this time when Abraham is writing this. And it's like, who's talking right now? What are they talking about? What's going on here? And Ibn Ezra, most of the people just kind of throw this away. Rashi tries to explain it in situo as like without it being any problem. Ibn Ezra's response is basically, he says something like, this is a very interesting line, Hamevin Yavin. Those who understand will understand, which is very strongly believed by most scholars to be Ibn Ezra implying that he knows that the document was edited later and was not given to Moses by God at Sinai. Again, full-on blasphemy. Olivia, go ahead, say what you're going to say.
Yeah, it makes me think of a couple of things. One, where the rabbis in the Talmud are like, the Torah is written in the tongue of people, or like where they're like, it's not maybe a pure God thing, but you can't hear God's voice in God's tongue exactly. Or the times when the rabbis just rewrite the text of the Torah themselves and show in the moment that they believe flexible document.
Yeah. If the rabbis are displeased with the way the Torah comes down with something, they'll spin it in a way that suits their purpose, which I think is well said. All right, let's do this next line. I'll do the Hebrew. Marion, if you don't mind, will you do the English for us? Thank you. Cheresh shote v'katan ein motzin et harabim yadei chovatan. Ze haklal. Kol she'enu mechuyav b'davar enu motze et harabim yadei chovatan.
Returning to its halachic discussion, the Mishnah continues. A deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor who sounds the shofar cannot discharge the obligation on behalf of the community. This is the principle with regard to similar matters. Whoever is not obligated to do a certain matter cannot discharge the obligation on behalf of the community.
Okay, quick definition of terms and a quick pardoning of the Gemara for being a 2,000-year-old politically incorrect document, but let's call it what it is, right? Cheresh is a deaf mute. The reason that probably deaf mutes were deaf mute was because they had not developed sign language, and or the understanding that the cheresh that we're specifically speaking of is probably an individual whose mental development was additionally affected by whatever defects also involve their hearing and their speech, or we're talking about a person who is purely just deaf mute, who their intellectual faculties would have believed to have been equivalent had they been given the proper schooling that we had in our current time. But nonetheless, a cheresh is deficient in lots of different ways back then because they weren't given proper instruction and or they weren't given the opportunity. Shoteh is a term that we've actually seen before. It can mean, we learned it as insane, but because we were talking a couple pages ago about a person who was shoteh when they blew shofar or they heard shofar versus someone who was lucid for a period, right? And we discussed as a group the fact that the Gemara clearly has this understanding of mental health issues that some people flow in and out of lucidity, right? Some people their mental illness acts up at times and it goes away. Shoteh can go both ways, though. It can be referred to people who are mentally insane, but it can also refer to individuals who are mentally deficient, intellectually stunted, right? Like so that they're not capable of understanding at the same age development level that the rest of us do. So, and finally, katan is a minor, so anyone under the age of 13. Or for girls under the age of 12. So that's a long-winded way of trying to get through all of the definitions of things that were not politically correct in our time and why they might have been the way they are. But the important part of this is past the disclaimer, which is that one who is not able to discharge others' obligations or who cannot have their own obligation discharged, cannot discharge the obligation for others. So if your frum cousin is 12 years old and is the best davener you've ever seen in your entire life, they cannot be shaliach tzibur for the congregation. They cannot go up and discharge everyone else's obligation. That's just the way it is. And note that these things are kind of equivalent, right? And I think that there's something good about that, which is we don't think an 11-year-old child is irrelevant to the Jewish community. We think there's great value in their participating in Jewish rituals, rites, and services. However, they cannot lead the service, right? So I think that that's a valuable gloss when thinking about these other two individuals, right? Someone who has mental illness, mental deficiency, profound hearing loss, is deaf mute, all these categories, right? They're not disqualified from the Jewish community. They just can't lead. And there's a variety of reasons for why that is. For the deaf person, the obvious reason would have been they can't hear, right? And if you can't hear the words that are coming out of your mouth, you can't be assured that you're pronouncing things correctly. And therefore, you can't discharge the obligation of someone who can hear. Some of these things have been modified in modern halakha. In the modern era, overwhelmingly in the conservative world, a deaf individual who does pronounce things accurately would be permitted to lead services. I have never seen that personally. I've never dealt with the issue around mental illness or mental deficiency and leading the congregation. I do know, though, in the conservative movement has pioneered B'nai Mitzvah for children who have developmental delays, right? Or who have autism. So that's a way in which the conservative movement has halachically kind of either carved out a space of permissibility or said it's not exactly identical to a b'nai mitzvah in the fully abled mental faculties way, but we've created an alternate track that is to serve this community. So, all right, Marion and then Rav Judy.
Okay, first of all, I think as far as a deaf person goes, in those days, I think they thought of a deaf person as mentally deficient.
Right.
And because
Often.
he wasn't able to communicate.
Right.
And as far as a katan goes, I don't think that they even thought of females. Girls were out of the picture totally.
Yeah.
I think so.
So there's three.
The other,
There's this triad that you see. Chera, Shotev, and Katan is one triad. The other triad that includes women is not this triad. It's a different configuration. That configuration, which appears frequently in the Mishnah, is women, slaves, and minors. Okay, that is Nashim, Avadim, Vakatan, and that is the understanding from most halachic authorities is that is intentional, meaning those triads are very specific, which also means here that women have an obligation to hear shofar, and potentially that women have an obligation, because women have an obligation, therefore they have the ability to discharge others' obligations, which means that going back to Talmudic era, if you were to read this section of Mishnah without any further commentary, hint, hint, it implies very strongly that in the Mishnah, women can blow shofar and fulfill the obligation of men. There are other places in Mishnah where in general, that is not the case, right? A woman overwhelmingly is not permitted to discharge the obligation of a man. That's because of a different set of rules in another place that are parallel and equivalent, which is that, and we've talked about this, that men are subject to time-bound commandments, whereas women are not. And therefore, a woman cannot discharge a time-bound obligation of a man. So prayer is a time-bound obligation. Shofar is a time-bound obligation. And so therefore, this text, if we read it by itself, would imply that women could blow shofar and fulfill the obligation of a man. But the rabbis will take another text from somewhere else and then say, actually, women can't blow shofar for men.
there's one other thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, go.
I don't know if you guys are aware that the Masorti movement here for many, many years has had a program for a special B'nai Mitzvah, B'nai Banot Mitzvah, girls and boys. And it's been wonderful. I've been to a few of their ceremonies, and these kids who are maybe autistic or have Down syndrome or all kinds of stuff, and they have their bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, and it's so emotional, so moving. The parents, the teachers, it's a wonderful thing.
Go ahead, Mark, and then Judy, and then I think Elisheva had a non-virtual hand, a literal hand.
Okay, I'm inspired by the free association quality of the Talmud, bringing in tangential items. So therefore, even though this is not directly connected, but I'm thinking of the latest member of Knesset, Shirley Pinto, who is deaf. And it was very moving to see her delivering a speech which was conveyed to the rest of the members of the Knesset by an interpreter. So that's a connection.
Nice.
Sort of.
Yeah, and I think it underscores the point, which is, and it's one of the strengths of the conservative movement, which is, if we were to be halachically pure and say Judaism must remain traditional without change, we would say the Mishnah states clearly that a deaf individual is not considered equal, to be blunt, to a fully hearing individual. And a minor is not considered equal. and a person with mental illness or mental deficiency is not considered equal. And, you know, one of the developments of the conservative movement is to kind of go back and say, like, this negation of equality is problematic, right? So we have changed these laws because they ought to be changed. Where there is a moral will, there is a halachic way, says my my teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. All right, Rav Judy, go ahead, and then Elisheva.
Well, equality is fine and it's very liberal, but do you think that 15-year-olds should be punished the same way as an adult if they commit a crime? Because that happens here a lot in this country, in many states.
Right.
Do you think that's right? And not a fully developed human being? But on a much lighter note, I'm just wondering, nobody here, as to Shoteh, nobody here has ever met a crazy congregational rabbi.
Right. Well said.
We had a paranoid delusional cantor for a year.
Oh, yeah.
So there you go. There you go. So
Right.
come on, guys.
Right. That's interesting. It's
It
well said.
happened.
And I think understanding, you know, you all know me well enough to know that I'm a shades of gray individual, that this kind of very clear line drawing that the mishnah likes to make, it's intellectually clean and it's simple. And by the way, rabbis have to be rule makers and say, this has to be a certain way, right? Every pulpit rabbi in the conservative movement has been asked at some point, especially if you've been around like I have, has been asked at some point to do a wedding between a Jew and a non-Jew. And I have to say, like, I'm sorry, I can't do that. So there are always places where the shades of gray, I have to say the shades of gray don't apply anymore. There are, you know, real, Rabbi Adelson has a challenge coming up because he has the congregation at Beth Shalom very strongly has laid it down that girls have bat mitzvah at 13, but he has an individual who knows the halacha where it says you can be a bat mitzvah at 12. And this individual has basically said, we're having the bat mitzvah when our daughter is, I think, 12 and a half or whatever. And it's just a thing. Like, you know, the halacha is X and the sock of the rabbi is Y. And there's some rub there.
And the halacha is scientifically more accurate. Girls are more mature at that age than boys.
Sure, but to Judy's point, the whole point of it is, are they actually adults at 15? You know, in rabbinic Judaism, the
Is a
answer
boy an
would be-
adult at 13?
Right. Would they have been subject to capital punishment? And the answer was back then, yes. But, you know, like, that's a whole nother rabbit hole to jump down. All right.
But the definition is obligated to the mitzvot, not a lot of civil law.
I'm not
They're
sure I
adults
understand.
in that they take on the commandments.
Right, but they take it. They become adults in all respects, meaning they get the schar for positive mitzvot, and they get the punishment for violating mitzvot
Right,
as well.
but they're not expected to support a family
You mean today or back then?
today. Back then was different.
Yeah, back then we married them off,
Kids
basically.
were grown up a lot earlier,
Yeah.
2,000 years ago.
Right, you were also probably dead by the age of 35, so that there's that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, Renee, go ahead.
You said that Rabbi Adelson goes by 13. I'd always heard that it was between 12. You had to do it after they were 12, but before they were 13. Why does Rabbi Adelson make that determination at Beth Shalom? Why is there a conflict?
I think it's the Religious Services Committee in consultation with Rabbi Adelson. You'd have to ask him. So, okay. Sorry. I wish I could. I ain't getting into trouble for speaking out of turn. Go ahead, Elisheva.
3 things, and I'll try to make them really quick. The other phrase, this is a very politically correct definition, translation. to deaf mute. The usual old phrase was deaf and dumb. And we think of dumb as meaning not able to speak.
Right.
But in fact, the word dumb comes from an old English word that means mute, which in turn comes from an older English word that means confusion, stupefaction, and dizziness.
Right.
So it's not surprising that it's used when we really did think until horrifyingly recently that deaf people who could not speak were not of full intellectual development.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what this really is referring to.
Yeah, I would
Really
say,
recently.
yeah, I would say two things. One is, thank God that Marilyn, who is in our Wednesday class, is not here, because Marilyn would give us a long explanation of how language has meaning and da da da. Secondly, I'll apologize for any partial misspeaking or not using the most politically correct term at any given moment, because the minefield that I just went through with those three terms was significant, right? We all remember the day, because we're old enough. Olivia might not be old enough because Olivia is the youngin in this class, but we all we all remember the day when retarded was the preferred term for those individuals who we now refer to as mentally deficient. The reason we don't use that term was when I was a kid in the 80s, you would get teased on the schoolyard and get called retarded, right? It became a pejorative. It became a pejorative word, right?
Pejorative.
Of course, the literal of it just means slow, right? And if you were gonna,
it means held back.
maybe, but it also, the implication
To
is,
retard something is to make it slower.
yes, but the implication is that it's the same implication as the term developmentally delayed. I think the reason we stopped using retarded was that it took on a pejorative meaning, not that it inherently has a pejorative meaning,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And so too a lot of the other terminology that we have changed over time. There have been terms that have been changed recently that we've started to kind of like say, well, do we want that one? I mean, my favorite was not favorite, but one example of this is there was a term third world, what was determined to be not fair. So the term was changed to developing world. Well, that was decided to be not fair because it was implying that our world was developed and their world was not developed. It was judgmental. Another term got applied, which was global south, right? Well, that was never accurate, because what about Kyrgyzstan, which is in the northern hemisphere but has a low, per capita income? And as we stand, as far as I know, nobody's come up with a term that everyone can agree with on all these things. So all you have to do at this point is say, there's a term for this thing. Some people are offended by it. And I do my best, but at some point I kind of recognize, like, not everybody's going to agree on the terminology here.
Yeah. My point about this is only that 2,000 years ago, they probably were thinking of it in terms that we nowadays think of as politically incorrect. Second quick point. Well, actually, let me do the third, which really is quick. Women are not obligated to time-bound positive mitzvot, except for the most quintessentially time-bound mitzvah that exists, lighting Shabbat candles.
Yes, and mikvah. Mikvah is time-bound to some degree.
But it's not so closely time-bound. I mean, if you're looking for time-bound,
right. That's a good point. I've never really thought about that.
There's nothing more time-bound than lighting Shabbat candles. The other point is not a point, it's a question. We keep slipping between the obligation with regard to shofar is to hear the shofar. And we talk about whether the blower of the shofar fulfills the mitzvah for him or herself. And we talked a number of weeks ago about the blower of the shofar fulfills the mitzvah because the blower also hears. And the mitzvah is hearing, not blowing. You need somebody to blow so that people can hear. So how can a blower fulfill the mitzvah for anybody else unless that anybody else hears, in which case they have fulfilled the mitzvah for themselves?
Yes.
not the blowing, it's the hearing.
Yes, I'll ask an additional complicated question, which we can't answer here, which is, I blow the shofar and I blow it into a extremely high fidelity recording device. And then it records it. And then I stand behind a curtain and the congregation doesn't know whether, and then I hit the button on the recording device and play the recording. Did they, and if they think I blew the shofar, but they heard a recording of it, did they fulfill the mitzvah of hearing shofar? Or is a recording of a shofar not actually hearing the shofar blown, which is a related note to all the things we've been dealing with before?
I would, in my great lack of authority in this regard, say they believe it's a real shofar blower. They believe it's a real shofar. They have the intent to hear a shofar. I believe they have fulfilled the obligation.
I would say no, and that's why last year when we had Zoom services for the pandemic, I said to everyone, we're going to do drive-through shofar, because I had real questions. As I feel like you can fulfill your.
But there, people know that it's not a real shofar. You were saying the shofar blower plays the recording without their knowing it's a recording.
I guess. Yeah, it's back to the problem of intent. All right, Marion and then Judy, and then we got to get going.
Okay, right. Another comparison to what Elisheva just said is that you go to someone's home or to a restaurant, they're kosher, so you eat. And if they're not kosher, it's not your sin, it's the party's sin.
Right. Well said.
You believe you're eating kosher.
Yeah, there's a great section. I had this whole fight with, I was co-mashgiach at the day school in Denver. I won't give you the whole story, but I had this fight. One of the mashgiachim, the other mashgiach, was really upset by something that the caterer did, and I had to tease it out. There's a basic principle in kashrut, which involves it's actually for Pesach. If a mouse takes a crumb of bread and brings it into the kitchen, right? And the question, and you find it like either after Pesach or during Pesach, right? Has the mouse rendered everything unkosher, especially in the time that you didn't know? Elisheva, I'm not looking for an answer, okay? Put your hand down. Because we're off topic anyways, and I want to get to this next section. So the
No
question
such
being,
thing as off topic in Talmud.
I know, but we're still dealing with the question of intent, which is, can something bring something in unintentionally and ruin everything, right? Especially if you do not know. That's the parallel to the thing. Rav Judy, go ahead.
The example you gave of the recording of the shofar being blown, playing the recording, is that just a fanciful thing that you made up, or did you actually do that?
No, God forbid. I wouldn't intentionally fool Jews into thinking they'd heard shofar.
Yeah.
No, I was hearing, there was a good episode of Radio Lab a couple weeks ago, and it was the story of how they did a 4-part Radio Lab on cassette tapes, highly recommended. And one of the stories was about basically the invention of the cassette tape, which was a guy in the Signal Corps in the US Army found a recording device that the Nazis had created, a Nazi scientist had created. And basically he did this with an orchestra in Los Angeles, California. He recorded he showed a bunch of studio executives at ABC an orchestra playing music. Then they dropped the curtain and said, all right, let's do it again. And the orchestra, he had recorded them playing that first part. And then he kept the curtain down. He played the recording, and then he opened the curtain midway through the recording, and the orchestra was all sitting there having a smoking break, and the recording was playing, and none of the studio executives could tell the difference between the orchestra and not. And that individual was Bing Crosby, and Bing Crosby was the first guy ever to have a pre-recorded video and audio of his television show back in the 1950s.
Wow.
He invented it because he wanted to tape his stuff early. So it's a great episode, highly recommended, but it asks the question, like, if you can't tell the difference, what does it matter? And the answer that Elisheva very well said is it's about intent. So anyways, all right, we're moving into that in the future where, like, manipulated things are really common. Elisheva, go ahead, and then we're finally.
And I have to say about the mouse and the crumb of bread, doesn't that go along with the chametz known and unknown that we annul the day before?
Yes. Except that line that we added comes after that whole thing in the Talmud with the mouse. So the thing with the thing kol afra da'ara is derived from the idea of the mouse. Olivia, and then Mark, and then finally maybe we'll do this little piece that I've been waiting to get to for 3 weeks.
I just while we're still on this, like, a recording of a shofar or a shofar, I like to think about keeping Judaism as flexible as possible for disaster dystopian situations.
Right.
In which all animals from which we get a shofar die, right?
Right.
Wipes them out entirely. Probably us and our actions and behaviors in the world. And then, like, are we just like, well, we can never fulfill shofar again? Or do we go back to this kind of discussion and pull out, actually, we could use some of those recordings from the before times of shofar, or change what shofar means, or something like that.
Yeah.
And the more hard and fast we make our stuff, the less flexible we make it for the history of disasters and revolutionary changes that we've had to go through and keep Judaism going through.
Right. And I think also in a related note, that was really well said. And I also think in a related note, in the reform movement, they've been talking for years about tefillin that are produced without harming animals. And the shot in the halacha of the conservative and the reform movement is, no, you can't do that. But maybe there's a time in the future, to Olivia's point, where we stop harming animals, we stop eating animals for our own benefit, and then we have to rethink tefillin. All right, go ahead, Mark.
No, just a point connecting to what Marian said and what you the example that you gave, maybe hypothetical, about the recording. That in the ceremonies that one ceremony that I saw for the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah of a child with special needs, one of the children, at least one of them, was not able to talk, and therefore that child pressed the button on a tape recording, and you heard the blessing, and sort of, it wasn't exactly to fulfill the obligation, but it was something pretty close.
Yeah, my friend Solomon Grunwald is a rabbi, and his son had cancer, brain cancer, and he made it to his bar mitzvah, but they knew that he was only going to be able to do as much as he was going to be able to do. And you wouldn't say that this kid with terminal brain cancer didn't fulfill the obligation of bar mitzvah because he couldn't make it through all of the rituals and rites, and he mumbled the bracha because he did everything that he could until he couldn't anymore because the work of doing it was exhausting. Anyhow, all right, let's do this last piece, the important piece. Paula, do you mind reading this in the English for us? Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, Hakol Chayavim b'Tkiyat HaShofar, or Tkiyat Shofar, Kohanim uLeviim vel Yisraelim, Gerim v'Avadim mishochorim, v'tumtum v'androgynus, mi shechetzio eved v'chetzio ben chorin.
Gemara, the sages taught that the following baraita: all are obligated to sound the shofar. Priests, Levites, and ordinary Israelites, converts, free slaves, a tumtum, i.e. those whose sexual organs from birth are concealed or are so undeveloped that it is impossible to determine whether the individual is male or female, or hermaphrodite, one who with both male and female reproductive organs, and a half slave, half free man.
Okay, so the pshat of the first of all, it's a baraita, meaning that it's a semi non-authoritative, depending on how the Gemara rules on it, parallel text to the Mishnah. But this text implies that everyone is chayav in tkiyat shofar. Everyone is obligated in the blowing of the shofar, which implies the simple understanding of that would mean that they're obligated to blow it, but that's probably not what it means. They're probably obligated in hearing a tekiah of the shofar, meaning the specific formulation of the notes, because that's the more logical way. And that means that everybody, right? And they immediately go into, they don't mention women, interestingly, but they go into people who have either indeterminate or dually determinate gender, okay? The reason that I wanted to get to this for weeks is because it's so important in Judaism in general, because I think in the secular society in America that we're dealing with, we've been having these arguments and conversations, particularly in America and in North Carolina, around bathrooms and who gets to go into bathrooms and all this ridiculous stuff. And there have been these statements that people have made that and this is me quoting other people, don't misunderstand me, to say that this came out of my own mouth, that the Bible recognizes only two genders, okay? That's a Christian perspective. For Judaism, it's wrong, right? For the Gemara has understood the existence of multiple genders since forever, okay? Here, the text is very interesting because it's based on the physical characteristics of the individual. So there are, according to the Gemara, to my understanding, 4 genders, okay? I think it would more appropriately be 4 sexes, right? Because it's about the physical characteristics. There is Zachar, male, Nekeva, female, tumtum, which is, I would say, is sexually neither, and androgynus, which is sexually both, okay? And these are to parallel what you remember from your 9th grade biology class, sort of the XXY or the XYY situations that occur occasionally, but there are also individuals who basically it's indeterminate or it's super determinate that they have certain sexual sex characteristics. Okay, I did my best to explain that as best as I could. I think what that also, one of the terms that might be used here is intersex, which is a person who would both physically and or gender-wise determine themselves to be kind of between both. But finally, the last thing that I think that this moves in the direction of is really the most important thing, which is to say Judaism recognizes that gender and sex are on a spectrum. They are not binary, 1 or 0 or 1 or the other. And most importantly, on top of all that, halacha determines that an individual can be seen as obligated in the mitzvot beyond being in the very clear category that defines them as such or as another. The final thing here, on top of all this, is they mix into here another parallel situation, which I feel like halachically, I feel a great obligation to kind of explain a little bit, which is the half slave, half free situation. By the way, we're going to start with this next time, so we'll do some more digging and unpacking, and I'll hear more from all of y'all. But and we will meet next week, so hopefully you are all available. If not, we'll miss you. So I think up to the 27th. I'm not on vacation yet. There is the case of an individual who, let's say you're a person and you steal 2 cars, a car from each of your cross the street neighbors, okay? And you wreck both cars, or you sell them for drugs, or you sell them to a chop shop and you blow the money on, whatever you blow the money on. You get caught. They arrest you. You go to jail. You get tried. You're in rabbinic Judaism. The trial would be that you owe both of these individuals kefel, meaning if you stole both of their $10,000 cars, you owe each of them $20,000. You ain't got no money. You say to each individual, I ain't got no money. The court says, you are now the indentured servant to both Rav Judy and to Olivia, okay? And you will work off the debt by working for either one of them. Okay. 3 years into your sentence with Rav Judy says, you've paid your debt to society. I am freeing you. Okay. Olivia says, you are still under my indentured servitude. You are now a half slave, half free person. You were once a full slave to 2 individuals, but now you've been freed by Rav Judy, but you are still enslaved to Olivia. That is the case of a half slave, half free individual. So if you were wondering what the hell is this, I have just explained it to you. Okay. That person is a really complicated halachic issue because they're half free, meaning their free side is obligated in certain mitzvot, but they're also a slave, meaning there are certain mitzvot that they may not be able to fulfill because Olivia at any given moment may say to the individual, I need you back here doing the work on the farm. You can't be, off, blowing shofar, right? I need you here. So that's the issue of the half slave, half freeman. And it is analogous in halacha to this issue of the tumtum and the hermaphrodite, the androgynus and the tumtum, because they're an individual that either has both statuses or neither status. And so it's difficult to determine whether they can be obligated. So this is a very complicated little thing, but overwhelmingly where the Talmud comes down with this baraita is to say a person who is partially obligated in shofar is fully obligated. They will not come down the same way on all halachas. Each halacha has its own status regarding this matter. Okay. I will take one final question and then I have to go because I am on a Beit Din for conversion. So I have to, the nice thing about being on a Beit Din is they can't start without me. The bad thing is it's bad to stand up your colleagues. So, anybody, who had Olivia gave me a attaboy in the, or an attaperson better in the chat, by saying perfect framing. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's a little tricky. I do the best I can. And Olivia says Avram and Sarah were tumtum. That must be a midrash that I'm not aware of, but it's a good one. There's the first human that's created in Genesis 1 is believed to be androgynus, meaning they have both sets of sexual organs, or maybe they're tumtum and they have neither. By the way, androgynus is always a sticky term because the Hebrew, which is derived from the Greek, of course, is an individual who has both sets of sexual organs. When we say someone is androgynous in English, we usually mean they are kind of genderless, right? So the Greek literal and the Hebrew literal and the terminology today are kind of opposites, and you have to hold that in your head. Any questions before we go? Great. I will go off to my conversion now. We have this as a recording.
Thank you, Mark.
Forget it. I hope all of
Great
you are well.
class.
We'll be back on the 27th.
When is your vacation?
Not for a couple more weeks.
Good.
Thanks, I guess. Bye, everybody.